The answer the tablets offer is not what modern popular culture might expect. There are no in a climate-controlled drawer at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. A clay tablet no larger than an open palm still carries the faint ridge marks of the scribe who pressed it flat sometime around 1800. BC, catalogued as CBS 10,673. The tablet records a session of divine judges beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki deliberating over human conduct. In the colophon, the scribe left a note he had copied every line from a manuscript already 3 centuries old. The text was not new even then. So what exactly were these beings that Mesopotamian civilization felt compelled to document so carefully for so long, spacecraft in these lines? No genetic laboratories, no technology vocabulary of any kind. What appears instead across thousands of texts spanning from roughly 2600 BC to the last centuries before the Common Era is something arguably more interesting. A portrait of cosmic administrators, divine judges, seated in an underworld court rendering verdicts over the dead according to laws they did not write but were bound to uphold. Tonight, we'll follow 3 traces left across 2,000 years of cuneiform record, the words themselves and what they meant in Sumerian grammar, the sites where these tablets were recovered, and what the archaeology tells us, and the patterns that stay remarkably constant from one millennium to the next, even as empires rise and collapse around them. The story begins as so many Mesopotamian stories do at Nippur. Between 1888 and 1900, a University of Pennsylvania expedition working in southern Iraq uncovered roughly 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the temple complex of Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind and the highest active authority in the early pantheon. The tablets came from stratified deposits within the scribal quarter rooms, where generations of priests had copied, studied and archived religious literature under institutional supervision. This was not a private collection or a single author's work. It was an official repository maintained by a temple establishment that managed vast agricultural estates, conducted elaborate rituals, and trained young scribes in the theology that underpinned royal authority across the region. Among these thousands indeed of tablets, one category of text appeared again and again, compositions describing a collective group of divine beings called the Anunnaki. Always in administrative and juridical terms, they sit in council, they deliberate, they vote, they render binding judgments. The language reads closer to governmental procedure than to anything we might recognize as myth in the modern sense. And what may be most striking is not any single description, but the sheer consistency across independent sources. Tablets recovered from Ur describe the Anunnaki school in terms nearly identical to those found at Uruk, at Lagash, at Babylon cities that were often political rivals, separated by centuries of conflict and cultural change. The Sumerian texts and their later Akkadian translations preserve the same core portrait. The early dynastic inscriptions from around 2600 BC align closely with Neo-Babylonian compositions written 2,000 years afterward. For a concept to remain that stable across such a span across language, shifts, dynastic collapses and foreign conquests suggests it occupied a very deep place in how Mesopotamian civilization understood the order of things. The term itself offers a quiet clue. In Sumerian, Anunnaki appears to combine 3 elements, and meaning heaven or sky god, none carrying a sense of princely or noble status, and possibly clear meaning earth or foundation. Though linguists note some ambiguity about whether that final component is integral to the word or simply a grammatical marker. What seems clear is the genealogical claim embedded in the name. These were beings understood as noble offspring of the supreme sky deity, who personified the heavens, not visitors, not colonizers, members of the cosmos itself positioned within a divine family tree that extends back to the universe's foundational elements. Their primary jurisdiction, at least in the oldest surviving sources, was the underworld, what the Sumerians called Kur, the Great Below. They're presided over by the goddess Ereshkigal. The Anunnaki sat as a judicial assembly. When the Epic of Gilgamesh describes Enkidu's dream of the afterlife, he sees them arrayed before a throne, while a divine scribe kneels beside the Queen of the Dead tablet, and stylus in hand reading aloud the record of each soul's earthly conduct. The judges weigh the evidence. They deliberate. They pronounce verdicts that cannot be appealed. The procedure follows formal legal protocols strikingly similar to those documented in actual Mesopotamian court records presentation of evidence deliberation among qualified judges binding sentence. Even gods were not exempt. In one of the oldest literary compositions known, The Descent of Inanna, with versions reaching back to approximately 2300 BC, the goddess Inanna herself enters the underworld and faces this same court. The 7 Anunnaki judges fix upon her what the text calls the Eye of Death. She becomes a corpse. No exception is made for her divine status. The law, it seems, applied to everyone. This judicial consistency points to something the texts return to over and over, the idea that legitimate authority operates within established rules rather than through a personal whim. The Anunnaki did not create cosmic law, they administered it. They consulted what the sources call the Tablet of Destinies, a kind of cosmic constitution containing the fundamental decrees governing reality, and applied those decrees to individual cases. They were executives of a system, not its architects. That framework divine bureaucracy governed by written law, structured into councils and courts staffed by beings whose authority derived from institutional position rather than personal power, tells us something not only about how the Mesopotamians imagined their gods, but about how they imagined governance itself. The parallels with earthly administration were deliberate and explicit. The Akitu New Year festival in Babylon included ritual reenactments of the Anunnaki assembly, conducted in a special chamber called the Ubshukina, where priests performed the roles of divine judges and formally determined the fates of the coming year. Theology and statecraft were not separate categories. They were the same system viewed from different altitudes. And yet, despite this rich and internally coherent record, the Anunnaki have become in recent decades something very different in popular imagination. Since the 1970s, a parallel interpretation has taken hold of one that reads spacecraft into divine chariots, genetic engineering into creation myths, and extraterrestrial colonizers into what the cuneiform plainly describes as underworld judges. That reinterpretation did not emerge from new archaeological discoveries or improved translation. It emerged from a modern longing for a certain kind of story. We will touch on that question gently before this night is done. But first, we begin now where the evidence begins with the clay, the script and the long silence of a scribal quarter at Nippur, where for over 1,000 years priests carefully pressed into wet earth their descriptions of beings they believed held the authority to judge every soul that ever lived. The clay quarter at Nippur. The scribal rooms at Nippur were not grand. When John Punnett Peters and Hermann Husand Hilprecht directed the University of Pennsylvania expedition through successive seasons between 1888 and 1900, the structures they uncovered in the temple precinct of Enlil were modest by Mesopotamian standards, low-ceilinged chambers, many barely large enough for 2 men to stand shoulder to shoulder, their mud-brick walls still bearing the faint discoloration where reed shelving had once been mounted to hold row upon row of drying tablets. The floors of several rooms were layered with fragments, tablets that had fallen, when the shelves finally gave way to time shattering on impact into the jagged puzzle pieces that archaeologists would spend decades reassembling. What came out of those rooms was staggering in volume. Approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets were recovered from the Nippur temple complex alone, making it the single largest repository of Sumerian literary and religious texts ever found at one site. And among those thousands, a particular category of composition appeared with a frequency that no one studying the collection could ignore. Texts describing a collective group of beings called the Anunnaki, always in language that sounded less like storytelling and more like the proceedings of an organized court. That frequency is itself a quiet detail worth pausing over. These were not rare references buried in obscure fragments. The Anunnaki appear across administrative records, ritual prescriptions, literary compositions, royal hymns and wisdom literature, virtually every genre the Nippur scribes practiced. The repetition does not feel incidental, it feels institutional. The tablets emerge from stratified deposits, meaning they could be dated with reasonable precision based on the archaeological layers in which they were found. Early dynastic texts from around 2600 BC lay beneath Old Babylonian compositions from around 1800 BC, which in turn sat below later material. This stratigraphy allowed scholars to track the Anunnaki concept across time, and what they found was an unusual degree of stability. The earliest references already describe the Anunnaki as a defined class of divine beings, with judicial and administrative functions, the same portrait that would appear in texts written 2,000 years later. There is no visible moment of invention in the record, no point where the concept seems to emerge from simpler origins. By the time Sumerian scribes began committing their theology to clay, the Anunnaki were already fully formed. The institutional context matters here. Nippur's Ekur temple, the mountain house of Enlil, was not merely a place of worship. It functioned simultaneously as a religious centre, an economic engine managing vast agricultural estates, and an administrative headquarters whose authority extended across Sumerian city-states. The scribes who composed and copied texts about the Anunnaki worked within this apparatus. Their training was supervised by senior priests who ensured doctrinal consistency. Their output was archived in purpose-built rooms equipped with clay preparation facilities, spaces where raw clay was processed, shaped into tablets of standardized sizes, and distributed to copyists, who reproduced canonical texts with painstaking care. The physical layout of the scribal quarter itself tells a story of deliberate knowledge management. Excavators identified what appear to be teaching areas where master scribes instructed apprentices, workspaces for active copying, and storage rooms where completed tablets were organized and shelved. The investment required to maintain this infrastructure, the institutional funding, the trained personnel, the dedicated architectural space argues against treating the texts produced here as casual literature or speculative fiction. The temple establishment committed serious resources to preserving this material because it considered the content essential. What these scribes recorded about the Anunnaki was within their institutional framework official doctrine. One small detail in the archaeological record deserves mention. Many of the literary tablets from Nippur show a distinctive surface treatment, a thin slip of fine clay applied over the rougher base before the scribe began pressing characters. This technique, which required additional preparation time and material, was typically reserved for texts considered important enough to warrant long-term preservation. Administrative receipts and student practice exercises rarely received this treatment. Theological compositions describing the Anunnaki frequently did. The distinction is not dramatic, but it suggests a hierarchy of value within the scribal output, with Anunnaki-related texts occupying a position of recognized importance. The care extended beyond surface preparation. Numerous tablets bear colophon scribal notes appended at the end of a composition that identify the source manuscript from which the copy was made and attest to the accuracy of reproduction. The tablet catalogued as CBS 10673, now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, carries precisely this kind of notation. The scribe working around 1800 BC recorded that his exemplar dated 3 centuries earlier. He was not composing, he was transmitting, and he wanted future readers to know that the chain of transmission was intact, that the words on his tablet faithfully reflected what an earlier scribe had set down in an earlier century working from sources that may have been older still. These transmission chains create a kind of textual archaeology beneath the physical archaeology layers of copying, reaching back into periods from which no original tablets survive, preserved only through the fidelity of successive scribes who understood their role as custodians rather than authors. The system was not perfect. Variant spellings appear. Occasional lines differ between copies, but the core descriptions of Anunnaki identity and function remain remarkably constant across all known versions, suggesting that scribes treated this material with a conservatism that resisted casual alteration. Nippur was not the only source. Tablets from Uruk, Lagash and Babylon preserve virtually identical accounts produced by independent scribal traditions in cities that were often political competitors. The consistency across these geographically and politically separate centres indicates that the Anunnaki concept was not a local cult belief or the invention of a single temple establishment. It enjoyed broad acceptance across Mesopotamian civilization, a shared theological framework that transcended the rivalries dividing individual city-states. What the Nippur collection gives us, then, is not a single document making a single claim. It's a vast institutional archive in which the Anunnaki appear as a fixed element of official theology, documented with bureaucratic precision, preserved with deliberate care, and echoed across independent traditions spanning more than 1,000 miles and more than 1,000 years. The question is no longer whether the Mesopotamians took these beings seriously. They clearly did. The question is what exactly they were describing. That begins with the name itself. The name pressed into the clay 3 syllables, pressed into wet earth, with the edge of a reed stylus, carried enough meaning to persist across 2,000 years of continuous use. The Sumerian term Anunnaki appears in cuneiform as a combination of recognizable elements, and the word for heaven or the sky god who personified it, none which carries connotations of princely status, nobility, elevated regal rank, and in some readings ki, meaning earth or foundation. The compound is not obscure. It follows standard Sumerian grammatical patterns for expressing genealogical relationships and social class, and its meaning is established through more than a century of philological analysis as by scholars, including Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobson, resolves into something both clear and quietly significant offspring of An or those of princely seed. The beings who bore this name were understood at the most basic linguistic level as noble descendants of the supreme ski deity, members of a divine aristocracy, defined by their lineage rather than by any single individual identity. That genealogical claim embedded in the name connects the Anunnaki directly to An, who headed the Sumerian pantheon during the 3rd millennium BC and represented the dome of heaven itself, the arching sky that separated the ordered cosmos from the primordial waters believed to exist above it. An was not an active administrator in most surviving texts. He functioned more as a distant sovereign, the ultimate source of legitimate authority who delegated practical governance to more engaged deities while retaining a kind of constitutional supremacy. His cult center at Uruk, the great temple complex called Eanna, literally House of Heaven, served as his earthly residence, and the prominence of his name at the front of the Anunnaki designation tells us something important about how these beings derived their authority. They did not hold power independently. Their legitimacy flowed downward from the highest point in the divine hierarchy, making them representatives or extensions of An's cosmic sovereignty rather than autonomous powers operating outside the established order. The structure mirrors what we know of Sumerian political life, where ruling elites claimed descent from city gods and exercised authority, understood as delegated from divine sources. The middle component Nun reinforces this reading in ways that have generated some scholarly discussion but ultimately point in the same direction. The Sumerian word Nun appears across a range of contexts, administrative, literary, royal, and in every case it denotes elevated social standing, someone who holds authority and commands resources. When applied to divine beings, it marks membership in what might be called the ruling class of the celestial world, distinguishing gods who govern cosmic domains from those who serve in subordinate capacities. The combination of An and Nun produces a compound meaning that is difficult to misread, princely offspring of the sky god noble descendants of heaven. The term functions not as a personal name, but as a collective designation similar in grammatical structure to how words like nobility or aristocracy identify social classes rather than individuals. Sumerian employs specific morphological markers for plurality and collective identity, and the Anunnaki designation consistently appears with these markers across thousands of textual attestations, confirming that scribes understood the word as referring to a defined group rather than to any single being. The final element, ki, introduces a degree of ambiguity that linguists have acknowledged without fully resolving. If ki functions as an integral part of the term rather than as a grammatical suffix, it would position the Anunnaki as beings situated between heaven and earth, celestial nobles whose jurisdiction extends into the terrestrial and subterranean realms. This reading aligns neatly with their documented roles as underworld judges and fate-determining administrators who apply divine law to human affairs. If alternatively ki serves as a locative marker, it designates where these celestial princes exercise their authority, essentially identifying them as heavenly beings who operate within the earthly domain. Either interpretation supports the same broad conclusion, and neither introduces anything that would require explanation beyond conventional Sumerian theology. The small uncertainty around ki is worth noting not because it undermines the analysis, but because it reminds us that even the most careful philological work encounters edges where the evidence permits more than one reasonable reading. Honest scholarship lives comfortably with that kind of ambiguity. It is the speculative traditions that tend to demand absolute certainty. What may matter most about the etymology, however, is what happened when the name crossed from one language into another. Around 2000 BC, Akkadian, a Semitic language with fundamentally different grammar and phonology, gradually displaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia. This was not a minor cultural shift. It represented a deep transformation in how people organized thought into language and theological concepts that survived. The transition did so only because bilingual scribes understood them well enough to find precise equivalents in the new linguistic system. The Anunnaki crossed that boundary intact. Akkadian scribes rendered the term as Anunnaki, preserving the essential meaning while adapting the word to Semitic plural formations and phonological patterns. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, a multi-decade collaborative reference project comprising 21 volumes compiled by scholars at the University of Chicago, documents this Akkadian rendering with extensive textual citations confirming that the translated term carried the same theological weight as its Sumerian original. Bilingual scribes working in both languages recognized the Anunnaki as an established theological category requiring exact terminological equivalence, not a vague mythological idea that could be loosely paraphrased, but a precise concept demanding careful translation. This linguistic continuity across a major language replacement is itself a form of evidence. Concepts that survive translation between unrelated language families do so because the receiving culture considers them important enough to preserve with fidelity. The Anunnaki were not reinterpreted or reimagined during the Sumerian to Akkadian transition. They were carried across whole, their identity and function intact, their name adapted but their meaning unchanged. The consistency of spelling and grammatical treatment across thousands of tablets spanning multiple dialects, geographical regions, and historical periods argues against any reading that would make these beings something other than what the linguistic record plainly indicates, a class of divine nobility descended from the supreme sky god, whose collective identity remained stable across the entire lifespan of Mesopotamian literate civilization. The words themselves, when read in their original languages with the tools modern philology provides, do not leave much room for ambiguity about what the scribes intended. But the name only tells us who they were, understood to be. The question of what they did, their function within the cosmic order, requires following them into darker and deeper territory. The great below. How did the Sumerians imagine the place where judgment waited? Not as an abstraction, not as a metaphor suspended somewhere in theological space, but as a location mapped, structured, and governed, with the same administrative precision they applied to the cities of the living. The underworld, which they called Kur or Kurnugia, meaning the land of no return, existed in Mesopotamian cosmology as a mirror realm beneath the surface of the earth, complete with cities, palaces, rivers, and an organized hierarchy of divine officials whose permanent residence it was. The Anunnaki did not visit this place, they inhabited it. The earliest Sumerian sources, dating back to approximately 2600 BC, consistently place them there, not in the heavens, not on mountaintops, but below, in the domain of the dead, where their authority was absolute and from which no appeal was possible. Later Babylonian theology would occasionally assign some Anunnaki members to celestial or terrestrial posts, but even those later texts maintained that the primary assembly met underground, with any Anunnaki stationed elsewhere descending to Kur for the sessions where fates were determined and verdicts rendered. A British Museum tablet catalogued as K3454, dating to the 7th century BC, describes precisely this arrangement, the Anunnaki of heaven and earth descending to the great below for the assembly of destinies. The underworld was home base regardless of where individual members might be temporarily posted. The geography of Kur was not left to the listener's imagination. Multiple independent texts describe the same architectural feature with striking consistency. 7 gates arranged in sequence through which every soul had to pass on the journey inward. At each gate the dead surrendered something, an item of clothing, a piece of adornment, a marker of earthly status, until they arrived at the innermost chamber stripped of everything that distinguished them in life. Kings and labourers, priests and farmers all arrived in the same condition before the Anunnaki court, naked, powerless, reduced to nothing but the record of their conduct. The stripping was not arbitrary cruelty, it was procedure. It ensured that the judges evaluated each soul on the basis of behavior alone, without the distortions that wealth, rank, or reputation might introduce. The seven-gate structure appears so consistently across different compositions and different centuries that it clearly represented a fixed element of underworld cosmology rather than a detail any individual author invented. And the number 7 itself carried weight throughout Mesopotamian symbolic systems. 7 tiers of the ziggurat, 7 days of the week, 7 planets visible to the naked eye, always signifying completeness, cosmic totality, a closed set that contained everything necessary. The judicial proceedings that awaited beyond those gates are described most vividly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically in Tablet 7, where Enkidu, struck by illness and dimmed by illness, sent as divine punishment, experiences a prophetic dream of the afterlife he is about to enter. In the dream, a figure with eagle talons seizes him and drags him down to the House of Darkness, where he witnesses the condition of the dead. Former kings now serving as menial workers, former priests carrying water in the dust. The dream culminates in Enkidu's appearance before the divine court. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, presides from her throne. Beside her kneels a figure whose presence reveals something essential about how Mesopotamians understood this system. Belit Seri, the divine scribe tablet, and stylus in hand, ready to read aloud the complete record of each soul's earthly life. The Anunnaki judges sit arrayed before the throne, and as each case is presented, Belit Seri consults what the text calls the record of conduct, a comprehensive account that cannot be altered, disputed, or appealed. The judges deliberate. They weigh the evidence against cosmic law. They render a verdict that determines where in the underworld's hierarchy the soul will spend eternity. Some receive relatively tolerable conditions. Others are consigned to deeper darkness. The procedure mirrors with almost uncomfortable precision the formal court proceedings documented in actual Mesopotamian legal archives, presentation of evidence, deliberation among qualified judges, pronouncement of binding sentence. The presence of Belit Seri is a detail that quietly refuses to be ornamental. Her title translates roughly as Lady of the Steppe, or Mistress of the Open Country. But in the underworld her function is purely bureaucratic. She is the archivist, the keeper of records, the official whose tablet contains every relevant fact about every soul that passes before the court. The concept of divine record-keeping was not a literary flourish. It carried genuine theological and ethical weight in Mesopotamian society. If your deeds were being written down by a divine scribe for eventual review by judges, from whom nothing could be hidden, then conduct during life mattered in a way that was concrete and consequential. The tablet Belit Seri held was not simply a list. It was in effect the prosecution's evidence file, complete, authoritative, and beyond challenge. The Anunnaki consulted it the way a human magistrate might consult a legal code, reading from their established records to determine whether the evidence warranted punishment or leniency. The entire system rested on documentation, on written law and procedure that bound even the judges themselves to standards they did not personally create. This is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the underworld court as the Sumerians imagined it. The Anunnaki did not rule by whim. They administered a system. They applied laws they were obligated to follow, consulted records they did not compile, and rendered judgments constrained by precedent and cosmic statute. Their authority was immense, but it was institutional rather than personal, procedural rather than arbitrary, and the implications of that distinction extended well beyond theology, reaching into how Mesopotamian civilization understood the very nature of legitimate power, a thread we will follow next through one of the oldest literary texts that has survived intact from the ancient world, the goddess who was not exempt. Somewhere in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad distributed, across fragments that scholars have painstakingly reassembled over the past century, lies a poem that may be among the oldest sustained literary compositions humanity has produced. The Descent of Inanna, with versions reaching back to approximately 2300 BC, tells the story of a goddess who walked willingly into the one jurisdiction from which her divine status could not protect her. And what happened when she arrived there reveals more about how the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki than perhaps any other single text in the cuneiform record. The poem does not merely describe the underworld court, it tests it. It sends the most powerful, most celebrated, most politically connected deity in the Sumerian pantheon directly into the chamber where the Anunnaki sit, and then it watches with a kind of theological calm as they treat her exactly the same way they would treat anyone else. Inanna was not a minor figure. She was the goddess of love, war, and political power, the patron deity of Uruk, one of the most important cities in Mesopotamia, and a figure whose cult commanded enormous institutional resources and popular devotion. When the poem opens, she has decided to descend to the underworld ruled by her sister Ishkigal. Driven by motives the text leaves somewhat ambiguous curiosity, ambition, perhaps, a desire to extend her dominion into the one realm that lay beyond her authority. Before departing, she takes a precaution that speaks volumes about what even a major deity understood about the Aqua place she was entering. She instructs her servant Ninshubur to appeal to the great gods for rescue if she fails to return within 3 days. The instruction is not casual, it is a contingency plan, an acknowledgement that the underworld operates under rules so binding that even Inanna might not be able to extract herself once she crossed the threshold. The Anunnaki's jurisdiction, it seems, was something that gods themselves approached with caution. The journey downward follows the 7-gate structure that appears consistently across Mesopotamian underworld literature, but the descent of Inanna provides the most detailed account of what happened at each threshold. At every gate, a gatekeeper acting under Ereshkigal's explicit instructions demands that Inanna remove one item before passing through. Her crown at the first gate, her lapis lazuli necklace at the second, her double strand of beads at the third. Then her breastplate, her gold bracelet, her measuring rod and line, and finally her royal garment. Each item represents not merely adornment but an aspect of divine power, a specific attribute of her authority stripped away layer by layer as she moves deeper into the realm where the Anunnaki hold court. The systematic nature of the stripping matters. It is not violent, it is procedural. Each gatekeeper follows the same protocol, delivers the same formulaic explanation. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned and waits for compliance before allowing passage. The repetition creates a rhythm that feels less like narrative drama and more like the execution of a standard intake process, a bureaucratic procedure applied without variation regardless of the subject's identity or objections. By the time Inanna reaches the innermost chamber, she has been reduced to nothing. No crown, no jewels, no insignia of office, no garment. She stands before Ereshkigal's throne, exactly as any dead soul would, stripped of every marker that distinguished her from the least consequential mortal. And it is in this condition that she faces the Anunnaki. The text describes the moment with a terseness that carries its own weight. The 7 judges of the underworld fixed upon her the eyes of death, and she was turned into a corpse. There is no trial scene here, no extended deliberation, no plea bargain or appeal. The judgment is immediate and unanimous, delivered through a collective gaze that functions as both verdict and execution simultaneously. The phrase eyes of death appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature as technical terminology for judicial condemnation. It is not poetic ornament but legal language, denoting the formal act by which a court transforms judgment into material consequence. Inanna becomes a corpse and Ereshkigal hangs her body on a hook like a piece of dried meat. The image is deliberately brutal, and its brutality serves a theological purpose. No one, not even the Queen of Heaven, stands above the law that operates in this place. The detail that the 7 Anunnaki acted in unison, that all 7 fixed their gaze simultaneously, suggests a procedural requirement rather than individual initiative. Capital sentences, it seems, required the full council's participation, a collective act that prevented any single judge from wielding the power of death alone. This is a remarkably sophisticated juridical concept for a text composed more than 4,000 years ago, and it parallels what we know of actual Mesopotamian legal practice, where courts of 7 judges heard the capital cases in human legal systems. The theological projection of earthly court structure onto divine judgment was not accidental. It reinforced the legitimacy of human legal institutions by presenting them as reflections of cosmic precedent while simultaneously constraining divine authority within procedural boundaries that even the gods had to respect. Inanna's eventual rescue, achieved only after 3 days through the intervention of Enki, the god of wisdom, who fashioned artificial beings to descend and petition for her release, does not undo the theological point the poem has made. The Anunnaki agreed to release Inanna only on the condition that she provide a substitute to take her place. A soul could not simply leave the underworld without compensation, because doing so would breach the fundamental boundary between the realms of the living and the dead. The substitution principle reveals something essential about how these judges understood their role. They were not punishing Inanna out of malice or politics. They were maintaining a system of cosmic balance that required strict accounting. Every transition between states of existence had to be offset. Every departure required an arrival. The ledger had to balance, and it was the Anunnaki's function, their permanent institutional, non-negotiable function, to ensure that it did. The poem ends, but the principle it established would echo across every subsequent Mesopotamian text that touched the boundary between life and death, or order and disorder. The world above and the darkness below, a boundary whose maintenance required something more than judges, something closer to what we might recognize as a constitution. The tablet that governed everything. Of all the objects described in Mesopotamian literature, none carried more weight than one that may never have existed as a physical artifact at all. The Tablet of Destinies, dubbed Shimati in Sumerian Tuppi. Shimati in Akkadian appears across the entire chronological range of cuneiform civilization, from early dynastic texts around 2600 BC through Neo-Babylonian compositions of the 6th century BC, and in every context it represents the same thing, the supreme instrument of cosmic authority, the written record of fundamental laws governing reality itself, this document from which the Anunnaki read when they rendered their judgments and upon which the entire structure of the ordered universe depended. Possession of this tablet conferred supreme power. Loss of it meant chaos, and the Anunnaki's relationship to it reveals with unusual clarity the distinction Mesopotamian theology drew between those who create law and those who administer it. A distinction that positioned these beings not as ultimate authorities, but as something arguably more interesting. Executives bound by a legal framework they were obligated to uphold but did not author. The tablet contained, according to various texts, the decrees established after creation, the laws governing celestial movements, seasonal cycles, weather patterns, agricultural fertility, the proper functioning of rivers and irrigation systems, and the fundamental relationships between gods, humans, and the natural world. These were not suggestions or guidelines. They were binding cosmic statutes, and the language used to describe them borrows directly from Mesopotamian legal terminology, the same vocabulary that appears in royal law codes and court proceedings. The Anunnaki consulted this tablet the way a magistrate consults a legal code, reading from its decrees to determine how established law applied to specific cases requiring adjudication. They interpreted, they applied, they enforced, but they did not legislate. The distinction matters enormously for understanding what kind of authority the Mesopotamians believed these beings wielded. Their power was constitutional rather than absolute exercised, according to established procedures and constrained by the very laws they were charged with implementing. Even Marduk, who in the Enuma Elish holds supreme executive authority as king of the gods, operates within the framework the tablet establishes, rather than overriding it through personal decree. The myth of Anzu, preserved in Old Babylonian, Middle Assyrian and Neo-Assyrian versions spanning several centuries, dramatizes what happened when this framework was disrupted. The narrative describes a monstrous bird creature, Anzu, who stole the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, while the god was bathing, seizing the cosmic instrument and fleeing with it to a remote mountain. The consequences were immediate and total. Cosmic mechanisms ceased functioning properly. Divine authority became paralyzed. The ordered processes governing heaven and earth ground to a halt because the legal foundation upon which they rested had been removed from its proper custodian. The Anunnaki appear in this myth not as the tablet's rightful owners, but as witnesses to the crisis and participants in its resolution. They support the effort to recover the wallet, and once the god Ninurta defeats Anzu and returns the instrument to Enlil, they formally ratify the restoration of legitimate authority. Their role is validating, certifying, ensuring that proper cosmic order has been re-established according to correct procedure. The ratification is not a formality. It is a constitutional act, an assembly vote confirming that authority has been legitimately restored and that the laws recorded on the tablet are once again operative. The Enuma Elish provides another angle on the same relationship. When Tiamat, the primordial sea goddess, raised her army of monsters in rebellion against the younger gods, she gave the Tablet of Destinies to Kingu, her chosen champion, conferring upon him the power to issue binding decrees and exercise supreme command. This transfer represented the highest possible delegation of authority, and its illegitimacy in the poem's theological framework lay not in the act of delegation itself, but in the fact that Tiamat had no constitutional right to reassign the tablet to a being the divine assembly had not sanctioned. When Marduk defeated Tiamat and captured Kingu, he seized the tablet and presented it not to himself but to Anu, the sky god who represented the ultimate source of divine legitimacy. Only after this proper disposition of the cosmic instrument did the Anunnaki assembly formally recognize Marduk's supremacy, and their recognition was the act that made his kingship legitimate. Without their ratification, Marduk's military victory alone would not have constituted lawful authority. The assembly's vote transformed a battlefield outcome into a constitutional settlement, and the Tablet of Destinies functioned as the instrument through which that transformation occurred. Several ritual and administrative texts describe the Anunnaki consulting the tablet during their judicial proceedings, reading from it the specific decrees that governed the situations before them and applying those statutes to individual cases. The consultative process is described in language that emphasizes careful interpretation rather than creative legislation. The judges examine what the tablet says, determine how its provisions relate to the facts at hand, and render verdicts that conform to the established legal framework. This is not the behavior of arbitrary rulers dispensing justice according to mood or preference. It is the behavior of a judiciary operating within a system of written law that constrains their discretion and requires them to justify their decisions by reference to authoritative texts. The concept is so close to what modern legal systems call rule of law that the parallel is difficult to dismiss as coincidence, though whether Mesopotamian practice influenced later legal traditions, or whether both arrived independently at similar principles, remains a question scholars continue to discuss without consensus. The physical nature of the Tablet of Destinies remains somewhat ambiguous in the sources. Some texts describe it as a single tablet, others suggest a series of tablets or a comprehensive archive. A few compositions attribute supernatural properties to it. The ability to glow with brilliant light to speak to respond to ritual invocations, suggesting that Mesopotamians understood this object as something more than ordinary documentation, an embodiment of cosmic authority in material form that could be accessed and administered only through proper procedures. The Anunnaki's mastery of those procedures was precisely what qualified them for their judicial role. They possessed the technical knowledge necessary to read, interpret, and apply cosmic law, a specialization that set them apart from other divine beings in much the same way that legal training distinguished judges from ordinary citizens in Mesopotamian society. Their expertise was institutional acquired through position rather than through personal genius, and it was this institutional expertise that made them indispensable to the functioning of cosmic order. Without qualified administrators to interpret and apply the tablet's decrees, the laws themselves would have been inert, written, but unenforced, authoritative, but impotent. The Anunnaki gave the cosmic constitution its operational force, and in doing so they occupied a position that was neither supreme nor subordinate, but something uniquely in between, powerful enough to determine fates, constrained enough to answer to a law they did not make. It is a portrait that tells us as much about how the Mesopotamians understood governance as it does about how they understood divinity, and both understandings would be tested when the cosmic order faced its most dramatic internal crisis, a rebellion from below. What the record does not settle. Before we move further into the structure of what these texts describe, it is worth pausing to sit with what they do not resolve, because honest inquiry requires holding the uncomfortable places open rather than smoothing them over with narrative momentum. The cuneiform record concerning the Anunnaki is thus remarkably consistent and institutionally grounded in ways that command serious attention. But consistency is not the same as transparency, and a record produced by powerful institutions raises questions that the record itself cannot answer. If we are going to follow these traces with any integrity, we need to acknowledge the places where the ground is less firm than it might appear, where reasonable doubt is not a weakness in the inquiry, but an essential part of it. The first uncomfortable question concerns the nature of the sources themselves. The overwhelming majority of tablets describing the Anunnaki were produced within temple establishments, institutions that functioned simultaneously as religious centers, economic powerhouses, and administrative arms of royal authority. The scribes who composed and copied these texts were not independent scholars working in a tradition of free inquiry. They were employees of a system whose theological claims directly supported its political and economic power. When a royal inscription declares that the Anunnaki decreed a king's right to rule, or that divine judgment sanctioned a military conquest, or that cosmic law required the population to deliver agricultural surplus to temple granaries, we are reading documents produced by the very institutions that benefited from those claims. The consistency of the Anunnaki portrait across different cities and centuries, which we have noted as evidence of stable theological tradition, could also be read differently, as evidence of a shared ideological framework maintained by interconnected elite institutions that had every reason to preserve a theology legitimizing their authority. The Nippur temple establishment, the Ur priesthood, the Babylonian scribal academies. These were not sea-slade operations. They exchanged personnel, shared curricula, and maintained networks of institutional cooperation that would naturally produce consistent theological output, regardless of whether that theology reflected genuine belief or strategic consensus among ruling classes. This does not mean the texts are fabrications. It means we cannot easily separate sincere theological conviction from institutional self-interest in sources where both motivations would produce identical written records. A priest who genuinely believed the Anunnaki determined human fates and a priest who found that belief politically convenient would compose the same hymn, prescribe the same ritual, and invoke the same divine authority in the same royal inscription. The cuneiform record does not provide a window into individual sincerity. It provides a window into institutional output, and the distinction matters not because it invalidates the evidence, but because it introduces a layer of interpretive caution that should accompany any reading of texts produced by and for powerful establishments. Some scholars have noted that the most elaborate Anunnaki invocations tend to cluster around periods of political instability or contested succession, when rulers had the greatest need for divine legitimation. Whether this pattern reflects genuine intensification of religious devotion during uncertain times or strategic deployment of theological rhetoric to shore up fragile political positions remains in most cases genuinely undecidable. The second point of honest uncertainty concerns the argument from absence that runs through much of the scholarly case against alternative interpretations. The academic consensus that the Anunnaki were theological concepts rather than anything else rests partly on the observation that cuneiform texts contain no technological vocabulary when describing these beings, no references to machinery, no descriptions of material processes that would suggest contact with an advanced civilization. This observation is accurate as far as it goes. The texts do not contain such language, but arguments from absence carry an inherent limitation. They demonstrate what the surviving record does not include, which is not the same as demonstrating what never existed. The cuneiform corpus, vast as it is, represents a fraction of what was originally produced. Tablets decay, archives burn, entire libraries have been lost to war flooding and the slow dissolution of unbaked clay returning to the earth from which it was shaped. The Nippur collection of 30,000 tablets, impressive as it is, constitutes the surviving output of a scribal tradition that operated continuously for over a millennium, a recovery rate that, however valuable, leaves enormous gaps in the record. We do not know what was written on the tablets that did not survive. We can only work with what remains, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that absent from the surviving record and never existed are not synonymous statements even when the surviving record is substantial. The third reservation is perhaps the most subtle, and it concerns the confidence with which modern scholars claim to understand how ancient Mesopotamians interpreted their own texts. The argument that educated scribes distinguished between literal history and theological narrative, that they recognized genre differences and applied appropriate hermeneutical approaches, is supported by evidence from scribal commentaries and school texts that do suggest sophisticated interpretive awareness. But we are reconstructing ancient epistemology from fragmentary evidence filtered through modern analytical categories, and the degree to which our understanding of genre maps onto ancient Mesopotamian cognitive frameworks remains a matter of inference rather than certainty. When a Babylonian priest performed a ritual reenacting the Anunnaki assembly during the Akitu festival, did he understand himself as performing symbolic theatre? Or did he believe he was participating in an actual cosmic event manifesting through ritual action? The texts that survive do not clearly answer this question, and different scholars reading the same evidence have reached different conclusions about where ancient Mesopotamians drew the line between metaphor and reality, if they drew such a line at all in terms that would be recognizable to modern epistemology. None of these reservations invalidate the textual evidence we have been examining. The Anunnaki remain the most thoroughly documented class of divine beings in the cuneiform record, described with a consistency and institutional seriousness that demands careful attention regardless of interpretive framework. But the pattern we have been tracing, the judicial functions, the cosmic bureaucracy, the constitutional constraints on divine authority, exists within a record that was produced by interested parties, preserved selectively by the accidents of material survival, and interpreted across a cultural distance of 4,000 years. The pattern is real, the consistency is real, the institutional investment is real. Whether those realities tell us everything we need to know, or only everything the surviving sources were designed to tell us, is a question that deserves to remain open as we continue forward into the text that describes not judgment or law, but the crisis that made the creation of humanity necessary, the rebellion that changed everything. The most complete copy of the Atrahasis epic, a clay tablet roughly the size of a man's forearm, densely inscribed on both sides with hundreds of lines of Akkadian cuneiform, sits in the British Museum under catalogue number BM78941. It was recovered from the ancient city of Sippar, and it preserves a narrative composed during the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC. Though the traditions it records almost certainly reach further back into Sumerian oral and literary culture. Fragmentary copies of the same text have been found at Nineveh, Assur, and Babylon, confirming that scribes across Mesopotamia considered this story important enough to reproduce, study, and to call boundaries. The narrative it contains is in some respects the most revealing text in the entire Anunnaki corpus, not because it describes their judicial functions or their cosmic authority, but because it describes the moment when the system they administered broke down from within, forcing a solution that would reshape the relationship between the divine and human worlds permanently. The epic opens by establishing a distinction that structured all of Mesopotamian divine society, the division between two classes of celestial beings. The Anunnaki occupied positions of authority as administrators, judges, and policy-setting executives. Below them laboured the Agigi, a subordinate class of gods, tasked with the physical work of maintaining cosmic infrastructure. The text is specific about what this labour involved. The Agigi dug the riverbeds of the Tigris and Euphrates, cleared irrigation channels, and performed the grueling hydraulic engineering upon which Mesopotamian agriculture entirely depended. The language the epic uses to describe this work borrows directly from the technical vocabulary of canal construction, the same terminology found in administrative documents recording actual irrigation projects carried out by human labour gangs under temple and palace supervision. The parallel was neither accidental nor subtle. The poem was describing divine society using the social architecture of the world its audience inhabited, and the implications cut in both directions. Earthly labour relations reflected cosmic precedent, but cosmic precedent was itself being narrated through the lens of earthly experience. For 40 years, according to the text, the Agigi bore this workload without rest, digging day and night, while the Anunnaki supervisors demanded ever greater productivity. The number 40 functions here, as it often does in Mesopotamian literature, not as a precise count, but as a conventional expression, meaning a very long time long enough for endurance to erode completely. The epic describes the Agigi counting their years of suffering, marking the accumulation of grievance, until the weight of it became unbearable. And then they did something that the theological framework had not anticipated. They rebelled. They burned their tools, marched on Enlil's temple at Nippur in the night, and surrounded the the divine palace demanding relief from their oppression. The scene carries a charge that reaches well beyond mythology. The image of labourers destroying their implements and confronting the administrative centre that profited from their work resonates with patterns of social unrest documented throughout Mesopotamian history, where forced labour populations occasionally revolted against the temple and palace establishments that extracted their productivity. The Atrahasis poet was not writing in a vacuum. The rebellion he described in heaven had earthly counterparts his audience would have recognized immediately. The Anunnaki response to the crisis reveals the deliberative process that characterized their governance throughout the cuneiform record. Enlil, chief of the council, initially proposed crushing the rebellion through force, the reflexive response of threatened authority. But Ea, the god of wisdom, argued for a different approach, one that addressed the underlying grievance, rather than merely suppressing its expression. The divine council debated these competing strategies at length, with the text recording multiple perspectives on how legitimate authority should respond when confronted by the organized resistance of those it governs. The sophistication of this theological debate is easy to underestimate. The poem does not present the Igigi rebellion as simple disobedience requiring punishment. It presents it as a structural failure, a system that placed unsustainable burdens on one class for the benefit of another, generating legitimate grievances that could not be indefinitely contained by force. The Anunnaki, for all their cosmic authority, had to acknowledge that the arrangement was unjust. That acknowledgement, embedded in a theological narrative composed nearly 4,000 years ago, represents one of the earliest sustained literary examinations of labour exploitation, institutional responsibility, and the limits of authoritarian governance in any civilization's written record. The solution the council adopted was radical in ways that would echo through every subsequent Mesopotamian text dealing with the relationship between gods and humanity. Rather than restructuring the labour system or distributing the workload more equitably among divine classes, the Anunnaki authorized the creation of an entirely new category of being, one designed specifically to assume the burden that Igigi could no longer bear. The goddess Nintu, working under Ea's direction, took clay and mixed it with the blood of a slain god, a deity named Geshtu, chosen for this purpose and sacrificed so that his divine essence would animate the inert material. She shaped 14 pieces of clay, 7 male and 7 female, and from these the first humans emerged. The process described is entirely supernatural, incantations, ritual actions, divine craftsmanship with no vocabulary suggesting technological intervention of any kind. The language belongs to the tradition of Mesopotamian ritual and magical practice, not to any technical or mechanical framework. Humans in this account were not companions or children of the gods. They were a labour solution created to perform the work that had driven the Igigi to revolt, freeing the divine classes from toil while introducing a new servant species into the cosmic hierarchy. The theological implications of this creation narrative are severe, and the Mesopotamians did not soften them. Humanity existed to serve. The purpose was not partnership or enlightenment, but maintenance, keeping the irrigation systems functional, the fields productive, the temple offerings flowing so that the gods could enjoy the leisure that divine status entitled them to. The Atrahasis epic presents this arrangement as a resolution that satisfied all parties. The Igigi gained relief, the Anunnaki maintained the infrastructure necessary for cosmic order, and humans received the privilege of existence in exchange for perpetual service. Whether the poet intended the arrangement to sound as transactional as it reads is impossible to know with certainty, but the creation of humanity as a response to a labour crisis, rather than as an act of love, curiosity, or creative expression, established a theological foundation that would shape how Mesopotamian civilization understood the human condition for the next 2,000 years. And that foundation rested on a question the Atrahasis never quite resolves: what happens when the solution becomes a problem of its own, the flood and the vote that split the council. How long does the solution last before the system that created it begins to reconsider? In the Atrahasis epic, the answer is measured not in years but in noise. Humanity, created to relieve the Igigi of their labour, fulfilled its purpose efficiently, perhaps too efficiently. The population grew, the cities expanded, the sound of human activity, construction, agriculture, commerce. The accumulated din of a species multiplying across the river valleys of Mesopotamia rose to a volume that disturbed the divine rest the Anunnaki had secured for themselves through humanity's creation. The text uses a specific Akkadian term, huburu, meaning uproar, or clamour, to describe what bothered Enlil so severely that he began contemplating the elimination of the very beings the council had authorized him to create. The word is not metaphorical in context. It denotes literal noise, the acoustic byproduct of a thriving civilization, and its appearance in the narrative introduces a tension that the epic never fully resolves. The beings designed to serve the gods had become, through their own success, a source of irritation to the authority that brought them into existence. Enlil's response was not immediate. The Atrahasis describes a graduated sequence of divine interventions, each more severe than the last, each designed to reduce human population to manageable levels without resorting to total destruction. First came plague, then drought, then famine. Each catastrophe was initiated by Enlil through the Anunnaki Council's authority, and each was quietly undermined by Ea, who covertly provided instructions to human communities on how to survive the crisis, redirecting worship to the specific deity responsible for each affliction, thereby securing that god's sympathy and relief. The pattern repeated through multiple cycles. Enlil authorized destruction. Ea subverted it, and humanity endured, diminished but intact. The narrative structure here is remarkably sophisticated in its portrayal of divine politics. It presents not a unified divine will imposing judgment on a helpless species, but a fractured council where competing interests and ethical positions produced contradictory policies. One faction advocating extinction, another defending humanity's right to exist, and neither able to fully override the other within the constitutional framework governing their deliberations. When the graduated measures failed to achieve lasting population reduction, Enlil convened the full Anunnaki assembly to propose the ultimate solution: a catastrophic flood that would eliminate humanity entirely. The council debate that followed is preserved in enough textual detail to reveal genuine theological complexity. Enlil's argument characterized humans as a failed experiment whose proliferation had exceeded sustainable limits and whose noise violated the fundamental purpose of their creation. They were made to serve, not to thrive independently, and their unchecked growth represented a systemic malfunction requiring radical correction. Ea countered with arguments emphasizing humanity's value as workers maintaining cosmic infrastructure, and questioned the proportionality of total extinction as a response to what amounted to excessive prosperity. The debate was not ceremonial. The text presents it as a genuine deliberation in which the outcome was uncertain until the assembly voted, and the vote itself established a principle that would carry significant theological weight. The Anunnaki operated through majority decision rather than unanimity. Enlil's proposal passed despite Ea's opposition, meaning the council could authorize actions that individual members found ethically objectionable, and dissenting members were bound by the collective decision even when they disagreed with it. The procedural detail embedded in this narrative is easy to overlook, but it carries implications that extend far beyond the flood story itself. A divine council that operates through majority vote is a council that acknowledges the possibility of legitimate disagreement among qualified authorities. It is a system that privileges institutional process over individual conscience while still permitting dissent to be voiced and recorded. Ea's opposition to the flood was not treated as pre-done or insubordination. It was treated as a minority position within a constitutional framework, overruled but not punished, defeated in the vote but preserved in the record. And this procedural space for principled dissent created the theological foundation for Ea's subsequent actions. When he warned the human Atrahasis about the coming flood and provided instructions for building a survival vessel, he was not rebelling against legitimate authority. He was exercising the residual autonomy that the constitutional system allowed to dissenting members acting on individual conscience within the boundaries of a system that had ruled against him but had not stripped him of all agency. The distinction is subtle but theologically profound, and it suggests that Mesopotamian intellectuals had thought carefully about the relationship between institutional authority and individual moral responsibility long before those questions entered Western philosophical discourse through Greek and Roman traditions. The flood itself, when it came, devastated humanity with a completeness that horrified even the gods who had authorized it. The Gilgamesh epic's version of the aftermath, narrated by Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh, describes the divine assembly reconvening in emergency session as the waters receded and the scale of destruction became visible. Several gods expressed horror at what they had sanctioned. Ishtar lamented that she had supported the proposal without fully considering its consequences. Other council members turned on Enlil, criticizing him for advocating excessive punishment. The self-recrimination was genuine within the narrative framework. These were not gods performing regret for human benefit, but a council confronting the catastrophic results of its own policy decision and acknowledging with a candour unusual in ancient theological literature that divine authority could produce divine error. The Assembly's willingness to question its own prior judgment to admit that a formally authorized decision had been wrong represents a theological position of remarkable intellectual maturity. It establishes the principle that legitimacy of process does not guarantee wisdom of outcome, that even properly constituted authorities operating within established procedures can reach decisions that are subsequently revealed as unjust or disproportionate. The flood narrative, Sumerian Old Babylonian, and the later version incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic maintain a consistent portrait of the Anunnaki across all versions. They appear as collective decision-makers whose authority derives from institutional position, whose deliberations follow recognizable procedural norms, and whose judgments affect cosmic order rather than merely expressing individual preferences. The texts present divine governance as operating through debate, voting, and implementation of majority decisions, while preserving space for dissent error and policy revision based on observed consequences. A council that can admit it was wrong is not a council of infallible gods dispensing perfect justice from an unassailable height. It is something more complicated and in its way more interesting. An institution staffed by powerful beings who are themselves constrained by the system they administer, capable of catastrophic misjudgment, and yet also capable of recognizing that misjudgment after the fact. That portrait of flawed institutional authority rendered in clay 4,000 years ago would find echoes in how Mesopotamian kings invoked the Anunnaki's name, not merely as a source of power, but as a framework for understanding what power required and what it could not guarantee. Kings who needed the assembly's voice. A single line repeated with almost no variation across royal inscriptions spanning 2,000 years, and 5 distinct ethnic dynasties tells us something about the depth at which the Anunnaki concept was embedded in Mesopotamian political life. The line rendered in various minor grammatical variations, but always carrying the same essential meaning, reads, "The great Anunnaki determined my fate for kingship." Sumerian rulers used it, Akkadian emperors used it, Amorite warlords who conquered Babylon used it, Kassite kings who ruled for centuries after them used it. Chaldean monarchs rebuilding Babylon in the 6th century BC used it. The formula survived every political upheaval, every foreign conquest, every dynastic collapse and replacement that Mesopotamia endured across its long history, and its persistence reveals that the Anunnaki's authority was not merely a theological abstraction discussed in temple libraries, but an active political instrument deployed in the most consequential arena of Mesopotamian public life, the legitimation of royal power. The earliest detailed example comes from Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, who ruled from approximately 2112 to 2095 BC, and whose administrative achievements included one of the earliest comprehensive legal collections known to history. Ur-Nammu's foundation inscriptions describe how the great Anunnaki determined his fate for kingship, framing his accession not as the result of military force or dynastic inheritance, but as the execution of a divine decree issued by the Cosmic Council. The claim served a precise political function. Ur-Nammu had seized power during a period of fragmentation following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, and his authority rested on shaky legitimacy that military success alone could not fully secure. By attributing his kingship to Anunnaki decree, he transformed a potentially controversial seizure of power into the fulfillment of cosmic law, something no earthly rival could challenge without simultaneously challenging the divine order itself. His law code, which predates Hammurabi's more famous collection by roughly 3 centuries, extended this legitimation strategy into the legal domain, by claiming that its provisions derived from Anunnaki principles of justice. The laws were not presented as Ur-Nammu's personal inventions, but as codifications of cosmic order binding on all members of society, including the king himself. The implication was radical in its quiet way if the law originated with the divine assembly rather than with the royal person. Then the king was subject to the same legal framework he administered. Authority came with constraints. Power came with accountability. The Anunnaki had decreed his kingship, but they had also decreed the laws that defined its boundaries. His son and successor Shulgi, who ruled for nearly half a century, from approximately 2094 to 2047 BC, elaborated this connection through royal hymns that describe divine designation ceremonies in remarkable procedural detail. The hymns portray the Anunnaki assembly convening specifically to evaluate candidates for kingship, examining their qualifications, debating their fitness, and ultimately selecting Shulgi through a formal vote that the texts describe, using the same legal terminology found in contemporaneous court documents. The descriptions read less like mythological narrative and more like minutes from a selection committee complete with evidence, presentation, deliberation protocols, and formal pronouncement of the assembly's decision. Whether Shulgi's court poets invented these procedural details or drew upon established theological traditions about how divine selection operated, the effect was the same kingship was presented as an institutional appointment ratified by qualified authorities rather than as a personal right seized through force or inherited through blood alone. Hammurabi of Babylon, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC, and whose law code remains among the most studied documents of the ancient world, deployed the same legitimation framework but extended its reach to justify imperial conquest. The prologue to his code declares that Anu and Enlil called him to promote the welfare of the people, and that the great Anunnaki designated him to establish justice in the land. The formulation is careful. It does not merely claim divine approval for Hammurabi's rule over Bedum, it claims a divine mandate for his unification of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority, transforming military campaigns that absorbed previously independent city-states into the execution of cosmic policy. Resistance to Babylonian expansion became within this theological framework resistance to the Anunnaki's will, an act of cosmic impiety, rather than legitimate political opposition. The strategy was effective precisely because the Anunnaki's authority was so broadly recognized across Mesopotamian culture. A conquered city's own priests would have acknowledged the Anunnaki assembly's legitimacy, even as they resented Babylonian domination, creating an ideological trap from which resistance could be framed as both politically futile and theologically impermissible. The Neo-Assyrian kings of the first millennium BC pushed this legitimation pattern to its furthest extreme. Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BC, described in his royal inscriptions how the great gods and all the Anunnaki granted him supremacy over the 4 quarters of the world and decreed victory over his enemies. These inscriptions accompanied detailed annals documenting military campaigns of extraordinary brutality, deportations of entire populations, systematic destruction of rebellious cities, extraction of crushing tribute from subject peoples. The invocation of Anunnaki authority in these contexts served to transform imperial violence into cosmic maintenance, presenting conquest and deportation not as expressions of royal ambition, but as the implementation of divine decrees, maintaining proper order against the chaos of resistance and rebellion. The theological language had not changed in substance from Ur-Nammu's inscriptions composed 14 centuries earlier. What had changed was the scale of the political actions it was being used to justify. The same formula that once legitimized a single king's rule over a coalition of city-states now sanctioned an empire's domination of the entire known world. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, who ruled from 605 to 562 BC, applied Anunnaki authority to a different category of royal action monumental construction. His building inscriptions found on foundation deposits, baked bricks embedded in walls, and clay cylinders buried within structures throughout Babylon consistently attribute his construction programs to Anunnaki command. The great Anunnaki commanded him to restore the temples and strengthen the city walls. These inscriptions were not meant for contemporary audiences alone. Buried within foundations, they addressed future generations who might excavate and rebuild on the same sites, ensuring that claims of divine authorization would persist across centuries. A strategy of ideological permanence that archaeological discovery has ironically vindicated. The consistency of Anunnaki invocation across all these rulers, Sumerians, Amorites, Kassites, Assyrians, Chaldeans, demonstrates that the concept transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries to function as a shared political theology accepted across the entire Mesopotamian cultural sphere. But kings were not the only ones who performed the Anunnaki's authority in material public settings. Once a year in the most elaborate ritual Mesopotamian civilization produced the assembly of the gods convened not in heaven or in the underworld, but in a chamber built by human hands for precisely that purpose, the chamber where fates were spoken aloud. During the first 12 days of the month Nisanu, corresponding roughly to late March or early April, in modern calendars the city of Babylon underwent a transformation that blurred the boundary between theological concept and civic reality, the Akitu festival. The most elaborate ritual event in the Mesopotamian religious calendar drew together priests, administrators, the royal household, and ordinary citizens in a sequence of ceremonies that simultaneously celebrated cosmic creation, renewed royal authority, and determined the fates of the coming year. At the centre of this 12-day cycle, on the 8th day, a ceremony took place that brought the Anunnaki out of the textual record and into physical, performative, institutional space. The divine assembly convened not as a mythological event described on a tablet, but as a ritual enactment conducted by living priests in a purpose-built architectural setting within the temple complex of Marduk. The chamber was called the Shekinah, a Sumerian term meaning chamber of destinies, and its existence tells us that the Mesopotamians considered the Anunnaki assembly important enough to warrant dedicated infrastructure, a room designed for no other purpose than to host the proceedings of divine judgment made manifest through ritual action. The architectural details of the Shekinah, reconstructed from textual descriptions and partial archaeological evidence, included elevated platforms where representatives of the Anunnaki sat in council, a central throne position for Marduk as presiding deity, and designated spaces for presenting offerings and evidence relevant to the deliberations. The arrangement followed a spatial logic consistent with both Mesopotamian throne room design and judicial court layout, hierarchical seating that made authority visible through physical elevation, clear sight lines between participants and a central focal point where pronouncements would be delivered. The room was not merely symbolic. It was functional, designed to accommodate a complex ceremony involving multiple participants performing distinct roles within a structured procedure that unfolded over hours. The investment in dedicated architectural space for a single annual ceremony underscores how seriously Babylonian institutional culture took the fate determination process. This was not an afterthought appended to more important rituals, but the gravitational center around which the entire Akitu festival was organized. The ritual texts prescribing the ceremony's procedures have survived in sufficient detail to reconstruct the sequence with reasonable confidence. The proceedings began with purification incense, burning, sprinkling of holy water, recitation of invocations that formally summoned the Anunnaki to convene in the chamber. Each member of the divine assembly was invoked by name and invited to take a designated seat, establishing the full quorum necessary for legitimate fate determination. The chief priest, assuming Marduk's role as presiding deity, then presented the evidence requiring deliberation. And here the ritual departed from what we might expect of a purely symbolic performance, because the evidence presented included actual administrative reports from throughout the Babylonian Empire, agricultural production figures, assessments of provincial conditions, evaluations of military threats, reports on natural phenomena, including flood levels, crop yields, and astronomical observations. The theological ceremony incorporated real governance data, integrating the practical business of imperial administration into the cosmic framework of divine deliberation. The deliberation that followed involved formal debate among assembly members, with priests voicing the positions various Anunnaki might advocate regarding the fates under consideration. The scripted nature of these exchanges should not be mistaken for emptiness. The debates address practical questions with genuine policy implications, whether the coming year would bring agricultural abundance or scarcity, whether foreign threats warranted military preparation, whether the king's performance merited continued divine support, whether preventive rituals were needed to avert natural disasters indicated by astronomical omens. Priests representing different Anunnaki perspectives argued for different courses of action, and while the outcomes were presumably guided by priestly consensus reached before the public ceremony, the deliberative structure created institutional space for competing assessments of conditions and priorities to be formally articulated and weighed against one another. The ritual was in this sense both theatre and governance, simultaneously a performance that enacted divine authority while channeling real administrative decision-making through theological forms. The fate determination culminated in formal pronouncements recorded in writing and proclaimed publicly. These pronouncements established the official destinies for the coming year, covering agricultural expectations, political stability, royal authority, and cosmic order, essentially producing an annual administrative framework that guided governance throughout Babylon and its subject territories. The ritual concluded with the Anunnaki assembly formally approving the determined fates and transferring executive authority to Marduk, and through him to the earthly king who would implement these divine decrees through the bureaucratic mechanisms of imperial administration. The transfer was not merely ceremonial. It constituted the annual renewal of the king's mandate to rule, and a king who failed to participate in the Akitu festival, or worse, who was denied participation by the priestly establishment, risked having his legitimacy publicly questioned. The ceremony thus functioned as a constitutional mechanism through which priestly institutions checked royal power, requiring the king to submit annually to a process controlled by the temple establishment and framed as the Anunnaki Assembly's sovereign prerogative. One detail from the ritual texts carries particular weight for understanding how Mesopotamians experienced the boundary between symbolic performance and cosmic reality. The texts describe the moment of fate determination using language that does not distinguish between representation and actuality. The priests do not pretend to be the Anunnaki or symbolize the divine assembly. The liturgical formulas state that the gods are present, that the fates are being determined, that the decrees pronounced in the Ubshukina carry binding cosmic force. The language is performative in the philosophical sense. It does not describe an event, but enacts one, bringing the divine assembly into material existence through the correct execution of prescribed procedures. Whether individual priests experience this as literal divine manifestation or as powerful institutional ritual operating through established convention is a question the texts do not answer, and perhaps could not have answered, because the distinction may not have been meaningful within the epistemological framework of Mesopotamian religious practice. The ritual worked, crops grew or failed, kings prospered or fell, wars were won or lost, and the working was sufficient validation for a civilization that measured theological truth by practical outcome rather than by abstract philosophical correspondence. The Akitu festival operated continuously in Babylon for centuries, surviving political disruptions, foreign conquests, and dynastic changes that transformed virtually every other aspect of the city's institutional life. Persian conquerors who took Babylon in 539 BC participated in the festival rather than suppressing it, recognizing that the ceremony's legitimating function was too deeply embedded in Mesopotamian political culture to be safely discarded. The Anunnaki Assembly's annual convocation had become infrastructure as essential to the functioning of Babylonian civilization as the canals that watered its fields or the walls that defended its perimeter. And like all infrastructure, it connected to systems far larger than itself, including patterns of thought about divine governance that extended well beyond Mesopotamia's borders into neighbouring cultures that imagined their own versions of the Celestial Council, operating under different names but strikingly similar principles. Other assemblies under other skies. What would it mean if only one civilization in one river valley had imagined its gods sitting in council to deliberate, vote, and render binding judgments on cosmic affairs? It might mean the concept was a local invention, a unique theological experiment born from the particular political structures of Sumerian city-states and extended through cultural inertia across 2 millennia of Mesopotamian literary tradition. But that is not what the evidence shows. When archaeologists began excavating the ancient port city of Ugarit at Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast in 1929, they uncovered a library of religious texts written in a cuneiform alphabet quite different from Mesopotamian script composed in a Semitic language distinct from Akkadian, and preserved within a cultural context that operated independently of Mesopotamian imperial influence. Yet the theology those texts described included a divine council that would have been immediately recognizable to any Babylonian priest, a supreme god presiding over an assembly of divine sons who deliberated regarding cosmic affairs, rendered judgments, and issued decrees affecting both divine and mortal realms. The god's name was El. His assembly numbered 70 divine sons. They met on a sacred mountain where El held court, receiving reports from subordinate deities and making decisions that governed the natural world and human political life. The structural parallels with the Anunnaki assembly are close enough to be uncomfortable for anyone seeking to explain either tradition as a purely isolated local development. The Ugaritic texts date to the late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BC, placing them within the broader, chronological range of Mesopotamian divine council literature, but emerging from a distinct cultural milieu. The city of Ugarit maintained trade connections with Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and the Aegean world, making it a crossroads where multiple cultural influences intersected. Whether its divine council concept derived from Mesopotamian influence, from a shared ancestral tradition, predating both civilizations, or from independent theological reasoning arriving at similar conclusions remains a question scholars have debated without reaching consensus. The differences between the two traditions are real and significant, the specific number of 70 members rather than 50. The greater emphasis on familial bonds between El and his divine sons, the integration of the assembly, with Canaanite fertility theology that had no direct Mesopotamian counterpart, but the underlying architecture is remarkably consistent, a supreme deity who delegates administrative authority to a council of qualified subordinates, deliberative procedures that structure decision-making, judicial functions that determine fates, and a constitutional framework in which even divine authority operates through institutional channels rather than through unconstrained personal power. The pattern recurs not as identical repetition, but as structural rhyme, the same organizational logic expressed through different cultural vocabularies. The Hebrew Bible preserves traces of the same pattern adapted to a theological context that was moving decisively toward monotheism, but had not yet fully erased the older framework from which it emerged. The Book of Psalms describes Yahweh standing in the divine assembly and rendering judgment among the gods, language that presupposes an audience of celestial beings before whom Yahweh exercises judicial authority. The Book of Job portrays the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh to report on their supervisor activities across the earth, a scene that reads almost exactly like the administrative reporting procedures described in Mesopotamian divine council texts. And in the Book of 1 Kings, the prophet Micaiah experiences a vision of Yahweh, seated on his throne with all the host of heaven standing beside him, deliberating regarding how to accomplish a specific political objective. The divine council in this passage debates proposals, evaluates options, and reaches consensus on a course of action, procedural steps that mirror the Anunnaki Assembly's deliberative process, with an intimacy that comparative scholars have found difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. The biblical texts subordinate all celestial beings to Yahweh's absolute authority in ways that the Mesopotamian sources do not, reflecting the monotheistic trajectory of Israelite theology. But the institutional scaffolding remains visible beneath the theological renovation. A council structure, a deliberative procedure, a judicial function that the biblical authors inherited from the broader ancient Near Eastern cultural environment and adapted rather than invented. The geographic spread of divine council concepts from southern Iraq to the Syrian coast to the highlands of ancient Israel covers most of the ancient Near Eastern world and encompasses civilizations that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and organized their societies according to different political principles. The consistency of the underlying pattern across this diversity suggests that the concept addressed something fundamental in how ancient Near Eastern peoples understood the nature of cosmic governance, a shared intuition. Perhaps that legitimate authority requires consultation, that judgment requires procedure, and that even supreme power benefits from the checks that institutional structure provides. The Anunnaki represent the most fully documented and elaborately developed expression of this broader pattern, preserved in extraordinary textual detail through a cuneiform tradition that recorded its theological convictions with a bureaucratic thoroughness no neighbouring culture could match. But they were not alone. The Assembly of Elat Ugaruhul, the Divine Council in the Hebrew Bible, and scattered references in Hittite and Egyptian sources all point toward a common ancient Near Eastern conviction that the cosmos was governed not by a single unchecked will, but by a deliberative body operating according to principles that even its most powerful members were expected to respect. This comparative perspective matters because it reframes the question of what the Anunnaki were. If they represented a uniquely Mesopotamian phenomenon, a theological oddity without parallel, then extraordinary explanations might seem warranted. But they did not exist in isolation. They occupied one position within a regional pattern of theological thought that spanned multiple independent civilizations, each of which arrived at the concept of the divine council governance through its own cultural development. The Anunnaki were the Mesopotamian instantiation of a widespread ancient Near Eastern understanding about how cosmic authority should be organized and their particular elaboration. The underworld jurisdiction, the fate determination rituals, the constitutional relationship to the Tablet of Destinies, say, represented the distinctive contribution of a civilization whose administrative genius expressed itself in theology as thoroughly as it did in irrigation engineering and urban planning. Understanding them within this comparative framework does not diminish their significance. If anything, it deepens it, revealing that the questions they embodied about the nature of justice, the sources of legitimate authority, and the relationship between power and law were not the preoccupations of a single culture, but the shared concerns of an entire civilizational horizon. And it is against that horizon that the modern reimagining of these beings as something else entirely, as visitors from beyond the earth rather than judges from beneath it, comes into sharpest and most instructive focus. What we bring to the clay. In 1976, a book appeared on shelves in American bookstores that would, within a decade, reshape how millions of people understood a civilization most of them had never studied. Zecharia Sitchin's The 12th Planet proposed that cuneiform texts, the same tablets we have been following through these chapters, describe not divine judges or theological abstractions, but extraterrestrial beings who had travelled to Earth from a distant planet, genetically engineered humanity as a labour force, and left traces of their intervention encoded in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia. The book sold millions of copies. It spawned a franchise of sequels, documentaries, and internet communities that continue to thrive decades later. And it accomplished something that the cuneiform record itself, despite 2 millennia of institutional effort, never quite managed. It made the Anunnaki famous. The irony is worth sitting with. The beings that Mesopotamian scribes documented with such painstaking bureaucratic precision across thousands of tablets achieved their widest modern audience through an interpretation that professional Assyriologists have consistently identified as fundamentally mistranslated and linguistically unsupportable. Sitchin claimed reading competence in Sumerian and Akkadian, but he lacked formal training in the philological methods that constitute the foundation of Assyriological research. Scholars who do possess that training, specialists who have devoted careers to compiling dictionaries from thousands of cuneiform sources, who read these languages with the fluency that decades of immersion produce, have documented numerous fundamental errors in Sitchin's translations. Basic grammatical constructions misread. Common words assigned meanings they do not carry in any attested context. Theological terminology reinterpreted through a technological lens that the original languages simply do not support. The Sumerian word for god Dingir and its Akkadian equivalent Ilu denotes supernatural beings fundamentally different in nature from humans, not merely more advanced versions of humanity equipped with superior technology. The creation narratives describe divine beings fashioning humans from clay and divine blood through ritual action and incantation, employing the vocabulary of Mesopotamian magical practice, without a single term suggesting laboratory equipment, genetic procedures, or mechanical apparatus. The texts, when read in their original languages by people trained to read them, do not say what Sitchin claimed they said. This is not a matter of interpretive preference or scholarly conservatism. It is a matter of linguistic for fact, verifiable by anyone willing to invest the years of study necessary to read cuneiform with competence. Yet the alternative interpretation persists, and its persistence tells us something that may be as historically significant as the cuneiform record itself. Not about ancient Mesopotamia, but about the contemporary culture that finds Sitchin's reading more compelling than the scholarly consensus. The ancient astronaut framework did not emerge from new archaeological discoveries or improved textual analysis. It emerged from a cultural moment. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968, had already established the interpretive template. The proposition that ancient achievements too impressive for modern audiences to credit to prehistoric peoples must be explained through extraterrestrial intervention. Sitchin applied that template specifically to Mesopotamia, and the result resonated with audiences who were in many cases navigating a particular kind of modern discomfort. Traditional religious creation narratives had lost credibility for many educated people in the late 20th century, but purely materialistic evolutionary accounts failed to satisfy desires for cosmic significance for the sense that humanity's existence served some larger purpose. The reinterpreted Anunnaki offered a middle path beings who were not gods in the traditional sense, but who were nonetheless intentional creators, designers, who made humanity for a reason, however utilitarian that reason might be. The appeal was not really about Mesopotamia. It was about modern audiences finding in ancient texts a creation story they could believe in after the old ones had ceased to convince. The commercial dynamics reinforcing this reinterpretation deserve acknowledgement as well, not as conspiracy, but as simple market reality. Publishers, documentary producers, and content creators profit from sensational claims that attract large audiences, and the proposition that ancient tablets describe extraterrestrial genetic engineers generates more commercial interest than the scholarly conclusion that they describe underworld judges administering cosmic law. The academic consensus, however well supported, lacks the narrative drama that drives popular media consumption. As seriological publications written in technical language for specialist audiences and published through academic presses with limited distribution cannot compete for attention with best-selling paperbacks, primetime television specials, and algorithmically promoted internet content designed to maximize engagement. The result is a persistent asymmetry between what specialists know and what the general public encounters, an asymmetry maintained not by any deliberate suppression of truth, but by the ordinary operations of a media marketplace where profitability and accuracy pull in different directions. What gets lost in this asymmetry is something that may be more remarkable than any extraterrestrial hypothesis: the actual sophistication of what the Mesopotamians produced. A civilization that conceptualized divine governance through deliberative assemblies, constitutional constraints on authority, written law, superseding personal power, judicial procedures requiring evidence and due process, and institutional checks on executive authority accomplished something intellectually extraordinary without any need for external assistance. The theological framework the cuneiform texts describe, in which even the highest gods operated within legal boundaries they did not create and could not arbitrarily override, anticipates political principles that Western tradition typically attributes to Greek philosophy or Enlightenment thought. The Anunnaki, understood as what the texts actually describe, represent a more impressive achievement of human intellectual history than the extraterrestrial alternative gives ancient Mesopotamians credit for. To replace divine judges administering cosmic constitutional law with alien genetic engineers is not to elevate the ancient world, but to diminish it, to assume that sophisticated theological and political thought could not have originated with the people who actually produced the written record documenting it. The tablets remain where they have always been, in museum drawers in Philadelphia, London, Berlin, Baghdad, and Istanbul, available to anyone willing to learn the languages in which they were written and to approach them with the patience their complexity demands. They do not speak loudly. They do not make dramatic claims about hidden histories or suppressed truths. They describe in the careful administrative language of a civilization that valued documentation above almost everything else, a class of beings understood as divine judges, who presided over the boundary between the living and the dead, who determined fates according to laws recorded on a cosmic tablet, and who maintained the fragile order separating civilization from the chaos that perpetually surrounded it. The Anunnaki were not gods in the way popular imagination has reconstructed them, neither the omnipotent deities of later monotheistic traditions nor the technological visitors of modern alternative history. They were something the Sumerians and their successors found far more necessary administrators of a system, custodians of a law, judges seated in the darkness below the earth, where every soul eventually arrived and where no rank, no wealth, no power earned in the world above made any difference at all. The clay holds what it has always held. The question, as it has always been, is whether we are willing to read what is actually written there, or whether we prefer the story we brought with us before we ever looked. The tablet is still there, CBS 10673 in its climate-controlled drawer at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, no larger than an open palm still carrying the ridge marks where a scribe pressed it flat on a morning in the 18th century before Christ. The colophon still reads the same copied faithfully from an exemplar already 3 centuries old. The clay has not changed. The characters have not shifted. The small, precise wedge marks recording a session of divine judges deliberating over human conduct remain exactly as they were when the stylus lifted for the last time and the tablet was set aside to dry in the Mesopotamian sun. If you held it now, you would feel the weight of it, not heavy, not precious in the way gold or jewelled things are precious, but dense with such a quiet insistence of something that was made to last because someone believed what it contained mattered enough to preserve across generations they would never live to see. We have followed those marks tonight across a long distance through the scribal quarter at Nippur, where the shelves eventually gave way through the 7 gates of an underworld imagined with such architectural precision that it feels less like myth and more like urban planning through council chambers, where divine judges deliberated according to procedures mirrored in the courts of the cities above them. Through a rebellion that changed the cosmic labour arrangement permanently through royal inscriptions that borrowed the assembly's voice to justify everything from law codes to imperial conquest, and through the Ubshukina at Babylon, where priests once spoke the fates of the coming year aloud in a room built for no other purpose. What we found was not a secret. It was not hidden or suppressed or waiting to be decoded by someone with the right key. It was written plainly in a script that scholars have been reading with increasing fluency for over a century, and what it describes as a class of beings understood by the civilization that documented them as judges, administrators of a cosmic legal system, bound by laws they did not write, seated in darkness beneath the earth, rendering verdicts from which there was no appeal. Whether that description captures everything the Mesopotamians understood about these beings or only everything they chose to commit to clay is a question the record cannot fully answer. 2,000 years of consistent documentation is extraordinary by any standard, but consistency tells us what a tradition maintained, not necessarily what it contained before the first scribe pressed the first stylus into the first wet surface. There are always layers beneath the earliest layer we can reach oral traditions, ritual practices, intuitions about the nature of the world that predate writing by millennia and that survived into the literate period only in the forms that institutional scribes chose to preserve. The Anunnaki we can study are the Anunnaki that survived the filter of institutional production, material preservation, and archaeological recovery. They are real in the sense that the textual evidence supporting their description is vast and internally coherent. But they are also partial in the way that all historical knowledge is partial, shaped by what endured and what did not, by which tablets baked hard in ancient fires and which dissolved slowly back into the earth they came from. That incompleteness is not a failure of the inquiry. It is the condition of all inquiry into the deep past. And there is a kind of honesty in letting it remain visible rather than smoothing it over with false certainty in either direction. The texts do not describe extraterrestrial visitors. They also do not explain everything about themselves. Between those two observations lies a space that is wide enough to hold genuine curiosity without demanding premature resolution, a space where the question of what these beings meant to the people who documented them can remain open alive, worth returning to on some other quiet night when sleep has not yet arrived and the mind is willing to wander. Perhaps the oldest comfort the Mesopotamians left behind is the simplest one, the idea that somewhere in a place that cannot be bribed or impressed or deceived a record is being kept. Not of what you owned or what title you held or how loudly you made yourself heard, but of what you did when no one of consequence was watching. The Anunnaki would read that record in the end. The clay would remember what the living chose to forget. Let that thought rest now. It does not need to be resolved tonight. The tablets will still be there in the morning, patient as they have been for 4,000 years, holding their small wedge-shaped marks in silence, and you, traveller, have followed them far enough for one evening. Let the weight of the question settle somewhere comfortable, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly without urgency, finding its own level in its own time. The dust of Nippur is very old, and it is not going anywhere. Close your eyes. Let the river valleys grow distant. Let the scribal rooms go quiet. Sleep will find you the way it always does, gently, without announcement, like a clay tablet being placed on a shelf in a room where no one is watching, to wait in the dark for whoever comes next.